that's kind of the point of Vcluster. And the way that Vcluster works is basically in the shared cluster, we create a virtual cluster inside of a dedicated namespace. So say that you're a developer on this cluster, and you want a Vcluster, you would get a namespace that has a pod running in it that, to you, when you interact with it, it looks like a full-blown cluster. And inside that pod is K3s, which you mentioned a little bit earlier. And K3s, the API server is there, and it's listening to API requests. And as an end user, it looks to you just like any other Kubernetes cluster.
Thank you everyone for joining us today on the TheCloudNativeFM podcast. This is episode number 32, and today we are talking about the virtual clusters. And most of the people who are unfamiliar with the virtual cluster side of things, this episode for you. And also people who are familiar with some kind of methodologies around multi-tenancy in Kubernetes, the namespaces, and the virtual cluster, the K3s clusters. For those who are familiar with that, we'll try to jump in and dive deeper into how virtual cluster uses K3s under the hood and how it's bring the multi-tenancy in Kubernetes so easy for all of us. So thank you very much, Rich Burroughs, for joining me today on the episode. And you are the people behind this awesome tool. So hand over to you to introduce yourself to my audience and start the proceeding.
All right. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm really excited to be here. Yeah, my name is Rich Burroughs. I'm a senior developer advocate at Loft Labs. We are the people who make this open source tool called Vcluster, which is mainly what I'll be talking about today. I think that when people hear virtual cluster, people are used to virtualization. It's a concept that we're familiar with in other ways. And this is sort of a way of applying that to how we share Kubernetes clusters between users. I'll be talking, you've got in the background our logo, I'll be talking mainly about Vcluster, which is our open source implementation of virtual clusters. There is another implementation that's made by the SIG multi-tenancy folks, and that's different. So most of what I'm going to be talking about today really applies specifically to our implementation. It's maybe worth checking out the other one too, their strengths and weaknesses. I think that ours is really fast, really easy to get started with, and it's honestly just fun to play with. Like I've really enjoyed using it, and I think that's not something to be underestimated, because sometimes, I was in ops and SRE for like 25 years of my career, right? And I used a lot of tools that I didn't like, and that caused me a lot of pain, and there'd be times where you'd get the page and you just don't even want to touch that thing because it's so scary or painful to deal with, and I think that it's good to have tools that are fun to use, and so we shouldn't sell that short. It's honestly, I just have a lot of fun playing with Vcluster.
Yes, absolutely. So before we jump into the virtual cluster and Kubernetes, so talk us to your experience and talk us about the Loft SH, who company behind this awesome tool. So tell us about how long you've been there and when did you open source this tool?
Yeah, so I've been with the company for I guess it's like 7.5 months now, which doesn't seem like that long, but we're a very early stage startup, and so I'm one of the oldest employees. I'm like employee number 4 or something. The company, our handle on Twitter and stuff is Loft SH, but the company name is Loft Labs, and well, the company was started by a few people. Our CEO, Lucas Gentile, and Fabian Kram, the CTO. They're co-founders. They had been working with another technology that we've open sourced called DevSpace, which is a tool for developer workflows. So you basically make a YAML file that kind of defines your developer workflow. A lot of people use it, for developing with Kubernetes. So that was the first thing they built. And then they started hearing from a lot of people who were struggling with multi-tenancy. And this is something that I've heard about a lot as well, right? Like I've been kind of around and involved with the Kubernetes community a little bit since, I want to say like 2015, so I've been, following it for quite a while. And I have a lot of friends who are really heavy Kubernetes users. And, one of the big complaints you hear, is about how hard multi-tenancy is. And honestly, it's something that that the tool wasn't really designed for, like it's pretty clear that if you look back, especially at like early Kubernetes, that like that was not a goal, right? Was multi-tenancy, it just wasn't built for that. And so it was, very open. One of the big things that's been happening the last few years is folks in the security space have been working a lot on trying to make it easier to secure too, because that's been another problem, and so it's actually, in a way, it's kind of similar to early Linux that way, right? In Unix, because Unix was the same way at first. It was like super wide open and you could do anything. And then as time goes on and people adopt these tools, suddenly these real world concerns come into place. Like, how do we secure this thing? How do we, deploy and manage clusters and all these things? So they started this company, Loft, and Loft Labs, and really there are two main things that we're working on besides the developer workflow stuff, and that's the multi-tenancy, and the virtual clusters are part of that, and self-service, and both of those are things that I think are really, really important. I've worked in operations very closely with developers for many years, and it's hard for engineers when they're just trying to get their job done, right? Like they've got something they need to get done by a certain date, and they need infrastructure, right? And they have to put in a ticket, for someone on another team to provision a cluster for them, and then they have to wait a couple days to get that, and all that time is time they could have been actually working on the thing they need to deliver. And it's very frustrating. And I dealt with that myself in other ways, if I needed a load balancer or needed the firewall team to do something for me, I would put in tickets for them. And people just lose so much time, and it's also just not fun, to be waiting around for something when you could be like doing your job. So really, those are the two big things that we're focused on, with Loft. The product is multi-tenancy and self-service. And so the virtual clusters are something that were actually built into our commercial product first, right? So those have been part of Loft for quite a while. Like when I joined in April, of 2021, virtual clusters were already there. But they weren't open sourced yet at that point. And that happened, I want to say about 6 months ago. And so since then, it's been really exciting. We've been seeing a lot of interest in this, because it's a really new field. And it's again, a problem that a lot of people experience, right? And so people just seem to be pretty excited about the tool. Lucas just did a talk at the last KubeCon in Los Angeles about the virtual clusters, and that was really well received. It seems like there's even more interest after that. And so, yeah, that's it's a really exciting time for us. We're still a really small team. I want to say we're like about 8 people right now, but growing, and it's really fun.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And the loft, in a very small amount of time, as you mentioned, is not old enough. But they bring out a tool, and as you know, when somebody people brings out the new tool to the public, there are so much bugs, so much feature that people like to see in these tool, and they want to provide a feedback. But when the virtual cluster came into the market as the open source and people try to use this tool, they see a lot of good features already have in it. That's the wonderful news for
Yeah.
everyone. And a lot of the people, a lot of the folks I talked to in the past about the virtual cluster, they're really inspired by the fastness, reliability, and maturity of the product in a very
Yeah.
shortest amount of time. That's a hats off to team who have built these kind of tools as well. So during the previously on the podcast, is it
Oh,
just
can I just say, sorry, let me, I just want to add one thing. I think that what you're talking about, with like how mature it was when we open sourced it, really does come from the fact that it was already in our commercial product, right? And so people had been using it for quite some time before we open sourced it. And by the time that happened, the folks building it also understood it really well, and we really, one of the reasons I decided to join this company was because I felt like they were tackling real problems that people have, like real difficult problems that a lot of people experience, and they were doing it in really smart ways. I could see that the way that they were building things was really smart. They understood Kubernetes extremely well, and that was a lot of what attracted me to join the company. So yeah, it's been really fun to see like how excited people are about Vcluster.
yes, absolutely. I think when I first time see the news of the virtual clusters being open source, I think there are a lot of appreciation from the community because we are missing this tool for a very long time. As you mentioned during the podcast, that in the multi-tenancy cluster, where people are really kind of a shy or kind of a reluctant or kind of afraid of using the Kubernetes cluster. I might not break the cluster. I might not spoil the production cluster. And there are so many things in the people's mind while working with the Kubernetes cluster. Either it's a dev cluster, but still people figuring out, I don't try this I think at home. I might doing something wrong in there. So there is a very reluctancy and people are really afraid of using the Kubernetes in their own way prior to this tool. So
That's that's a really interesting point, and we talk a lot about the benefits of virtual clusters, and that's one that I think we maybe don't talk about as much is the idea that because they are so easy to spin up and so fast, like you can just throw it away and make a new one, right? So if like something goes wrong and you're not sure what's going on, like as a developer, you may not be in a position to like, you know, troubleshoot Kubernetes, that might not be your area of experience, and so yeah, I mean it's really easy to just, delete one and make a new one.
yes, absolutely, absolutely. And during I work for the team here in my job, and there are application developers who work on the Kubernetes. They don't understand the
Yeah.
full components of Kubernetes because there is so much
Yeah, of course.
and they're just replying apps on top of it, and they want to test it out. And after the day ended, they want to tear down the whole Kubernetes cluster. So they're looking forward. They'll ask it. I think in the 3 months back, I think there is a virtual cluster. You can try it out, test it out. I think there's the most excited tool we ever have got it. And then they look at the tool and they're impressed by it because they want to test it out, their app on Kubernetes cluster. And after the day ended, they
Yeah.
want to tear down the cluster with the one command and everything backs to the normal. So that's the really we're missing on the part of it. So if we start about the
Yeah, it's oh, I just want to say one thing. It's interesting because to me, like empathy is really important, right? When you're working on a platform team and you're providing tools to developers, it's really important to empathize with them, to try to understand their viewpoint. And there are some developers out there who are super interested in Kubernetes and want to learn all about it. And there are people who don't, and that's okay, right? Like if you're a developer and you get hired by a company to build an application, right? Like learning about Kubernetes is taking away from time that you could be building your application, right? And that's probably the thing that you're getting measured on, right? Is like how much you're shipping and how good of a job you're doing building your application. That's the thing that's going to get you a bonus or a promotion or a good performance review, those kinds of things, right? And so I totally understand, engineers who don't want to dive deep into Kubernetes, who want to focus on building their applications. I think that's a totally fair point of view, and we do need to keep those people in mind for sure.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I think a lot of the time, the people who are just doing mistakes might be they bring in some innovations on top of it, and they want to continuously think breaking and putting the cluster in the normal. And while I end up doing these kind of experimental feature, might they pave the way for the innovations? Because a lot of the innovations happens
Right.
in the past is because of these mistakes. People are building something else, and the rest of the things is they end up having something imaginary coming up into their mind. So I think having these kind of minds were missing because the Kubernetes cluster is very big. People don't want to spoil the cluster, and somebody want to share the cluster with another folks. They end up doing things in their own way. Then we have a spoiling. This setup is being a very chaos creating in the team. That's you broke my cluster. I'm shifting the view and these kind of stuff. So they want to work with in their isolation. So can they end up relying on what their thinking was and what their mind thinking at this moment of time. So I think that's really important, the virtual cluster and the multi-tenancy and these kind of things. So I had on the past the Justin Garrison on the episode, and he drew a wonderful point, and I want to throw it back here today. He talk is multi-tenancy is not about I'm not want to share my cluster with my somebody else, with my folks. It's about migrating Kubernetes to the next version. That's really a vital for piece for us. Like we want to jump from the Kubernetes 1.19 to 1.23, but end up transitioning to the newest cluster. I want to test things in my laptop. How do I test it? I don't want to break the dev environment. I don't want to break the testing environment. I don't want to break the production environment. Where do I test those things? So there's a multi-tenancy is a better fit for it. So draw some point on what is multi-tenancy and also the migration in Kubernetes. Why still people think that's really a complicated process?
Yeah, of course. So multi-tenancy is basically like having multiple tenants in a cluster, right? Like multiple users, and that could be an individual developer. It could be a team. You might consider a tenant, but it's basically sharing clusters. And at this point, in practice, there's really been two main approaches to how people deal with provisioning clusters. One approach is to have shared clusters and use namespace isolation, right? So like an individual developer or a team, they get their own namespace. And then the other option has been everybody gets their own cluster, right? So an engineer or a team, they get their own cluster. And both of those approaches are problematic in different ways. When it comes to namespaces, one of the big issues is that there are certain types of objects in Kubernetes that are global, right? Like CRDs. And if you're like locked down to a namespace, you can't manage those objects, right? So that's one issue. And then on the side of everybody gets the cluster, there's a bunch of problems with that, right? The big one that's going to come to a lot of people's mind is cost, right? If you've got a million clusters running, it's going to cost your company a lot of money. But there's other things besides that. It's hard to manage. Like how do you manage thousands of clusters? How do you deal with that? How do you manage the life cycle, make sure that the right things are running in them, all of that, you know? A lot of that you can automate, you know, but when you get at that kind of scale, you know, there are going to be problems. There always are, and they just kind of multiply, you know, the more clusters that you have. But I think that the other thing that maybe doesn't get discussed enough that's really important is that this all has an impact on the environment too. Holly Cummins from IBM, I'm gonna actually just present for a moment and share my screen. I have this up. Oops. Oh, I don't actually, oh no, I have a problem. This isn't you, but it looks like my permissions aren't set up right for me to share on Meet. So anyway, but Holly Cummins from IBM, she gave a really, really great talk at KubeCon back in 2020 about this problem. It was one of the keynote talks, and basically, you know, there are so many clusters out there, and a lot of them aren't even being used, right? People provision these clusters and they need them for something, and then they forget to decommission them, right? And they're still running, and she called them zombie clusters, right? And these zombie clusters really, you know, they're using up power. They're, you know, they need to be in some sort of cloud data center that's got, you know, cooling and all kinds of other energy is getting wasted, you know, to run these things that aren't even being used. So that's another problem with, you know, just provisioning a bunch of clusters for everybody who needs one. The other thing about that too is that, you know, provision clusters isn't fast, right? You know, and so I mean, it's relatively fast if you're using, you know, a managed cluster through a cloud provider, or like, you know, you can hit the button and get a GKE cluster in a couple minutes, but still, you know, that's time that people are waiting around. So this is really the problem that we're trying to address with the virtual clusters and with Vcluster is that you know, it's hard to you know, developers, it's easier for them if they can just kind of be an admin, right? Like if they can just, you know, not have to bug somebody to get, you know, something changed in the cluster itself. And again, you know, you can't really do that in a shared cluster in a real secure way. So that's kind of the point of Vcluster. And the way that Vcluster works is basically in the shared cluster, we create a virtual cluster inside of a dedicated namespace. So say that, you know, you're a developer on this cluster, you know, and you want a Vcluster, you would get a namespace that has a pod running in it that, to you, when you interact with it, it looks like a full-blown cluster. And inside that pod is K3s, which you mentioned a little bit earlier. And, you know, K3s, the API server is there, and it's listening to API requests. And as an end user, it looks to you just like any other Kubernetes cluster. And so you can interact with this thing. You can, you know, deploy help charts. You can, you know, deploy, you know, deployments. You know, anything that you could do, you know, with a normal cluster, you can do. And the idea is that these virtual clusters are really easy to spin up. You can spin one up in just a few seconds, you know, and it solves that problem, right? It gives you a shared environment, but people in their own namespace, in their own environment, they kind of have their own cluster or their own virtual representation of a cluster.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And on the topic of, let's say, as we discuss about the virtual cluster and the importance of these kind of setup, and also I think we tend to forget this kind of, when the newest member of the team joins your company, we need to get set up some permission to this newest member of the team. Might be is not familiar with the Kubernetes cluster, and when you share this cluster with this person, he might end up break some kind of things. And that's also
Yeah, of course.
that's also spoiling the whole environment that people are talking about. Why you don't come up with that solution, that and people are not doing mistake on the Kubernetes cluster. And also when you have this kind of notion of being promoting and be it asking people to do this kind of stuff, you end up motivating the people to learn and try new things. And when we have virtual cluster, it's give us a very easy, like a wonderful experience for the developers, and also the wonderful we can train our individual in a very smallest amount of time. That's another very good news for you. We end up in we having a team in here where I work. We using the same methodology. Like they give them access to the virtual cluster. He can run out his command, work on these kind of setup. Then if you're familiar with the Kubernetes cluster, we gain access to the main cluster that the developer are using. So I think.
Oh, that's such a smart idea. That's fantastic. It reminds me of many years ago when I started learning Git. I had been using other kinds of version control before I started using Git, and at first really confused me. And honestly, I was afraid of it, because I didn't want to break our repo that we use to manage all of our infrastructure, right? And I was, every time that I checked something in and or did a rebase or whatever, I was like holding my breath, hoping that it all worked, And what I ended up doing to make myself more comfortable is I created a Git repo of my own that was on GitHub. It wasn't associated with work at all. I just threw a bunch of random files in there just to have something in there, and I played around with it, and I learned how to use it and how to, especially how to fix problems, right? Like if things did break, how do I get back to a good state, right? And once I learned that, I felt much more comfortable. And it's really interesting. I hadn't really thought of that as like a use case for Vcluster, but it totally is. And that's super exciting to hear that you all are doing that.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Because a lot of the folks, they are really interested in exploring the cloud native scams, cloud native landscape. Like I am, like I'm at the company,
Yeah.
I'm using the Linkerd service mesh, and they are using the different ingress
Mhm.
controller, like different storage solution. But I try to think, I try to discover a lot of the new tools that popping up into the Kubernetes landscape, the cloud native landscape, and they don't allow
Yeah,
me to work with these kind because it spoiled the whole dev cluster. So what I try to end up
of
doing,
course.
I try to come up in my laptop and try these things, but it requires me a few more hours of it's reducing my sleep because I have to spun up a cluster in my laptop and then try to install these things on this kind of. But during this Vcluster, I can set up. I on the office hour when I have a lunch break, we have my office hours expire. I try to experiment on these things in the virtual cluster. That's another use case for the people. Because a lot of the people I try to ask people, do you discover this tool? They ask me. I am absolutely love to, but there are some limitation to that. I try to and I say
Yeah, like where do I run it? Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, no, this is really interesting. You're mentioning a lot of things that honestly I hadn't even thought of necessarily as use cases. So that's always exciting. We were on a stream a while ago with David with Rockcode, and we were talking to him, and it was the same thing. He was like coming up with use cases that I hadn't even thought about. The big one that he came up with was developing operators, because Vcluster has got 3S in there, and you can say what version you want to install, right? So you could have multiple vClusters running with different versions of the Kubernetes API and test against those. And that again was something that I hadn't even considered, was like having that be part of like an operator testing workflow. So it's a really flexible tool. It lets you do a lot of things, and it's more isolation than just namespace isolation, right? Because each user does have their own API server. They have their own dedicated API server, and so that can help both with isolation and also a little bit with scalability, right? Because it's not your main Kubernetes API server that's taking all all of those requests, they're going to the Vcluster API server. So in terms of the architecture, like I said, there's that K3s API server inside there. There's not a scheduler in the virtual cluster. So, so the way that works is the scheduler on the host cluster, the one that the Vcluster is running inside of, that's the one that's used to schedule like pods. And the way that works is there's a syncer process that basically, when a new pod's, when you go to start up a new pod inside the virtual cluster, it, syncs that information to the host cluster, and then that scheduler picks it up and runs it. And so there's a really good demo that Lucas did in his KubeCon talk. Maybe you can link to that so that people can actually see it at work. But he shows pretty clearly, how that all works. And when you're in the host cluster and you look at those pods, they actually, because you don't want name collisions, the pods actually have the name of the Vcluster, like, in the pod name. And so it's pretty cool when you see, the different kind of layers of like, inside the Vcluster, I can only see my stuff, but when I'm in the host cluster, I can see like all of the pods that are running in all the Vclusters.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I will link to these, all the talks that you mentioned during the podcast in the YouTube channel. If everybody would like listening to this podcast from the YouTube, grab the links available on the chat and enjoy those talks as well. And also, I think the virtual cluster, there was kind of a similar story to the serverless. Like when people talk about the serverless, they think about the one problem set, but end up people are doing so many good things with these serverless platform, and people don't think about when they're developing solution for the serverless, but they have so many use cases people have created and try to solve those problems. And that's also we're talking about during the virtual cluster setup. There is not just one particular use case, there is so much of them. Like one of the use cases that I tend to think about is that previously I have on the podcast the chaos engineering team with the litmus chaos tool. So I try to use this tool.
I actually worked for a chaos engineering company a few years ago, so I know it pretty well. I'm not Litmus specifically, but I understand that field really well.
Yes, absolutely. So they introduced me to the litmus chaos. Then I asked my team, I want to test those things. When I avoid me, not we are ready for this. Then I try to test those things in the virtual cluster. That's another use case of it using these kind. Also, there are some mechanisms, the CI/CD tool. You need to because the CI/CD tool are creating the cluster and then deploy test and runs the chaos engineering test. A lot of these kind of stuff as well. But during you also try to test things manually. There are some scenarios you try to test few things manually. You
of course
can't trust on the automation.
You're just troubleshooting a problem or something.
Yes, absolutely. And on the same side, there's another use case. We can have another cluster, the visual cluster. You don't spoil the automation, work as smoothly, and create another big virtual cluster on side of it, and then run the manual test on these kind of things. So there are so many use cases on top of it. We can even talk about those use cases.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that CI/CD is a really big one. I think that to me it's really great for dev environments. Obviously, we use it inside of our commercial tool. So a user using Loft can self-service provision a virtual cluster. You could do that with the open source tool as well. It's got a CLI that lets people spin up their own virtual clusters. So that I think is a really good use case, but I think that CI/CD is a really good one because, depending on how your tests are set up, you've got the systems under test, and that could be a VM, it could be a cluster or whatever, right? And, some people want to be able to kind of throw that away with like every set of tests. They want to be able to run some tests and then throw it away and have a clean environment and start over and run some more tests, right? So if you've got a big test suite, and you're doing that, you could, be provisioning clusters, multiple times during the run of your full test suite. And it's not fast to provision clusters, and so you could be and the longer your test suite runs, the more developers are waiting around for feedback, right, on whether their stuff works or not, and that's just wasted time. So anything you can do to reduce, the length of your test suite, is going to help your cycle times. It's going to help your developer productivity, and when people talk about cycle times and getting that fast feedback, a lot of times they think about it strictly in terms of productivity. But I think there's another part to that again, which is that it just makes people happier when they can do their job and do it fast and efficiently, right? Like if you're sitting around waiting forever for a bunch of tests to run, like it's just not fun. You'd rather be productive. You'd rather be getting your job done. And so I think that whatever you can do to reduce that time that your test suite runs, that's good in multiple ways, and making developers happier is definitely one of those. And I think it's a great use case for Vcluster, because these clusters spin up in like a few seconds, and I've not seen a way of provisioning full Kubernetes clusters where they spin up in a few seconds.
Yes, absolutely. And one more use case that I try to draw here as well, because one of the companies reach out to me and they ask me to train our developers on the Kubernetes side of things. So I asked them that, because if you train Kubernetes people on Kubernetes and you have 10 or 20 of the people, you need 20 Kubernetes cluster. So everybody can have a separate cluster. So they ask me, do you need 20 cluster? I think we don't. We can actually use one cluster. We have a 20 virtual cluster inside of it, and people can train on the same way. Because in the Kubernetes side of things, and that's the approach I'm going to be using the next year on training people. Like they have a one cluster and 20 cluster within it, virtual clusters, and then train those people in. Because during the smooth experience, people don't do so much heavy stuff in the small part of the time. You just try to run the kubectl command, list and the node, list the pod, list the
right, really basic things.
Things. So for that part, absolutely, the virtual cluster can work out for the training part as well. That's another best use cases, and I'm going to use this use case and will share with you later in the next year after I start.
That's a great one. I'd love to hear about how you set it up. I've actually, in one of my previous jobs, I did trainings like that, with users where, everybody had to have their own Kubernetes cluster, or they would share a cluster between like just a few people. But it was hard, and it was also expensive, because we would do these trainings and we would have a whole bunch of, EKS clusters running, and we're on the clock for those, right? We're paying for those, and that's it would have been great to just give everybody a vCluster instead, like inside of one EKS cluster. It would have saved us some money, and it probably would have saved us some problems too, in terms of troubleshooting, because we'd provision all these clusters, right? And then you'd have to test each one and make sure it's working before you could hand it over to the people who are going to use it in the training. So that's such a great idea.
Yes, absolutely. And after the training, you want to end up these clusters not going for the day, another day. You want to spoil that up, like to tear down this cluster. So end up next day, another cluster is spinning up and these kind of stuff. So for removing the bot is really essential, because end up you having a cloud bill that's come in the billions of, you have to train 10 people, but you end up giving the Amazon to, I think, $200 for so much money for these clusters.
Right.
That's really a pain point. And also, when you spun up cluster in the Kubernetes, people are working in a different machine, like somebody using the Ubuntu machine, somebody using the WSL, some using the Docker container, some using like Linux machines. There are so much stuff happening. But giving them the access to the virtual cluster is actually is really it's get us a lot of the pain from the trainer. Like I come up everybody and create a virtual cluster for me, and then during the process there are something happening inside there. So I'm definitely going to use this technique for my trainings from the next month, like December I starting training there. So I will definitely
That's super cool.
I will definitely share my this experience with all the both with you. So I think today we discuss a lot of the use cases. There are
Yeah.
so many other, but we have a very short amount of time available. Might be I share some blog posts, but how do we can share these virtual clusters?
That would be fantastic. I mean, it's so much fun for me, as somebody who, is working at the company that built this stuff, to like hear all the different ways that people are using it. Because I mean, again, it's such a flexible tool, right? And so you can use it in so many, like, think of all the different ways that you could use Kubernetes clusters, right? And that's pretty much all the ways that you could use vCluster. I do think that those ideas of like training and learning are really, really cool and interesting ones. And I think that like one of the other tools that I think people use for that stuff a lot is Kind,
Yes.
and Kind is great, but I think that there are differences between them, and that I think that vCluster has advantages, for at least some use cases. Again, I think it's even faster to provision a vCluster than it is to spin up a Kind cluster, So yeah, it's been really fun to hear you talk about all these different ideas. One thing I want to mention is that you've got the logo behind you. There is a website. It's just vcluster.com, and that has a really good getting started guide that kind of walks you through like how to use it for the first time. It's really easy to install. It's like a single binary, you just download it, or if you're on a Mac, you can install it with Brew, I think. I think that's how I have it installed. But it's really easy to install. It's really easy to get started with, and I think that like you can pretty quickly kind of see how easy it is to use. You do need a Kubernetes cluster to run it inside of, and so you've got to have that before you can use it. So it doesn't replace that. So typically I run vCluster inside Docker Desktop on my laptop, or Minikube, or in a GKE cluster. I run it lots of different ways, but that's one thing that you do definitely need, is that that host cluster that you're going to run it inside of.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I think there is so many use cases to it, and also all the things you mentioned during the podcast, like the website and the KubeCon talks, is all already available. And also one of the wonderful videos from the Victor Forkic on the virtual cluster that I really like about it on his YouTube channel. I think it's a 20-minute long video, but it's described a lot of the wonderful things in there, how the virtual cluster work, and it's been a wonderful demo. I think that's also available on the chat as well. So these are the few things that we can come up with the virtual cluster use cases. So tell us.
There's one.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say there's one other video that we have on the YouTube, and I can give you these links too if you don't have them. But there's a video there called vCluster Inception, where I show that you can actually run a vCluster inside of a vCluster,
Yes.
right? So
yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
So that's pretty fun. And again, it just kind of, I think, shows how flexible it is. It's honestly, like I said, I think it's really fun to use. It's fun to talk to people about. This has been so great to hear about the different ideas you have for how it could be used, because they're, we're a company, we're mainly selling to platform engineering teams, that's more of our customer base. And so that's more, I think, how we tend to think of like the use cases. And so these ideas of like, like using it for learning and training and things like that aren't things that I really had thought about, but it's pretty exciting. And I definitely encourage people to use the open source tool to try it out. Like I said, this is part of our commercial product. And so if you want more support and you want, more tools around it, we're actually, just today, we've released a new feature where within the commercial product, you can set up a template. So you can say, every time I spin up a vCluster, I want to have like these 5 Helm charts installed or something like that. So there's a little bit more automation around it, but the open source tool works great too. And we love if people use that as well.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I think I will encourage everyone to take a look at it, and if you have some feedback around it, if all those you can share those feedback on the Twitter with Rich Burroughs. The Twitter handle is listing here in the YouTube, and definitely reach out to Rich on your use cases. And if you have some difficulties around using the tool, you can tell us about those difficulties because the feedback is really important for the open source project. and
Yes,
and
absolutely.
and feedback is really for we are getting really taking an eye out what you want to see in these tools. The end user community is really vital for any open source project. All these efforts are actually put forward for your production use cases, for your easiness in for the Kubernetes and these kind of stuff. So go out and out to us, and we will be happy to get in touch with you, get involved with you on the Visual Cluster side. And if you have some new ideas around it, feel free to share a blog post on that, tag Rich Burroughs or me. We will take a look at it, provide us feedback how you can use Virtual Cluster, and it will really make us happy when we think about these another use case scenarios because
Yeah.
that's really important for us. So thank you, Rich.
Yeah, we have a community Slack too. So if you go to vcluster.com, there's a link to it there. It says Slack. You know, we're in there, the people who are building the tool, but also there are other vCluster users, you know, in there as well. So you know, if you know have questions or want to, you know, bounce ideas off of people, that's a great way to do it. It is on GitHub, you know, and so there are people like opening issues and doing that kind of thing. If you have ideas, you know, for the project, we'd certainly love to hear them. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you very much, Rich. It's wonderful talking to you. Actually, we've done a lot of use cases around that, and we've done about how the virtual cluster work inside it. We have K3s cluster in it. It's so easy to spun up. There are Helm chart coming up in the new in the release that's coming up. So there are so much more stuff coming up as the product more mature, evolve. So it's one of the fewest tool that I've seen, I have noticed during the cloud native landscape that's coming up as an open source and mature and has so many features tried and tested out as Rich Burroughs during the talk about that is already been working for the commercial offering, and then they put out this open source tool. So they learn the engineering behind
It's
it.
changing all the time, right? Like you know, like I mentioned, the whole reason we built this was because of feedback that we got from people in the community, right? Because we were hearing that that multi-tenancy is so hard. That's the whole reason that this thing was built in the first place. And so we definitely want to get feedback. Kubernetes and the cloud native ecosystem is so complex. You know, we do have occasionally people run into edge cases where they're trying to use some tool with it that doesn't, you know, work for some reason. And so definitely, if you have those kinds of problems, let us know. You know, open an issue or come to the Slack.
Yes, absolutely. So I encourage everyone to listening to us, join the Slack channel, or and you can ping us on any social media. We'd love to hear your feedback. Try to connect with you, and share feedback is important as you all understand it. And we are really looking as a team behind the virtual cluster is really looking forward to the feedback, and they will reach out to you. So thank you very much,
Yeah,
Rose.
I'm also both in the community, the Kubernetes Slack and the CNCF Slack, and I'm just Rich Burroughs in there. So those are other ways to reach me. Thanks so much for having me on. This has been so much fun. I really enjoyed talking with you about vCluster.
Yes, absolutely. I really enjoy. I learned a lot during this session how it's actually work under the hood. So you really drives the conversation forward, and really enjoyed talking to you today. So try to catch up you again in the next year on the virtual cluster side as the project more mature and more features built into it. So thank you everyone who tuned into this channel, Cloud Native FM. We talk to you again in another episode with another guest. Bye bye. Stay safe and stay healthy.
About just if you are looking at the provisioning a Kubernetes cluster. So on top of that, Tanzu comes with pre-installed packages and also packages that you can select to install. They're not installed, but they're there and ready for you to install with just a few commands. So let's back up a little. So Kubernetes, the way I see, is sort of like an operating system, right? Or an operating system that sits on top of an operating system. What do we call that? Kubernetes? But I'm saying is